So what I want to do today is kind of give you a little bit of a sense of my broader project, and then relate it to the theme that Uroš has given us today. And in particular, I want to examine the history of the Frankfurt School through this idea of institutional critique. And in particular, I want to reverse a little bit, I guess, the standard critiques of the Frankfurt School, and the standard critiques of Habermas as being kind of a liberal, uncritical thinker in opposition to the first generation. And I want to say that actually, the people who make that argument have it exactly wrong. That the first generation was actually bourgeois, liberal, and conformist, and that it's Habermas that is much more critical, both in his philosophy and in his kind of public commentary. And I want to make the argument that in particular that is because he shifts Frankfurt School discourse away from kind of social, cultural, and psychoanalytic categories towards political categories, towards institutions. So that's my connection to kind of what Uroš is trying to do. So that's just a quick outline of what I'll do. Talk a little bit about the first generation. I'll talk about Habermas, both philosophically and politically. I'll give you an example, and I'll finish up. Okay, so just a little bit of background on what I'm doing. So my talk today is part of a broader project, provisionally entitled Engaged Critical Theory. Here in Habermas is a public intellectual. And the basic idea is there are tons of intellectual biographies of Habermas already, even though he's still alive. But none of them really focus on Habermas's work as a public intellectual, on what he has called his secondary vocation, his Nebenberuf. And I actually think this is a big mistake, because if you look at sort of, perhaps not the volume of pages, but just the number of publications, Habermas has actually published more in newspaper articles, more kind of public-facing texts than he actually has philosophical or theoretical texts. And I think there's a lot of people who either ignore that work completely, or who sort of treat it the same as his philosophy. And both of those are mistakes. I think we really need to see these things as different, and in some sense as the kind of political writings filling the gaps, the practical gaps left by Habermas the philosopher. And in particular, I think that this sort of helps us understand why Habermas is still a critical theorist, and his kind of understanding of change, his understanding of political activism, and kind of the role that philosophers and intellectuals should play in kind of politics and in public affairs. And so my basic thesis is that perfectly ignorant or apathetic towards real politics, that Habermas's critical theory of political institutions actually provides a better foundation for both diagnosing the pathologies of the present and addressing them politically. So, let me give you a little bit of my critique of the first generation. So, when Horkheimer, right, he takes over the institute. It's been around since 1923, actually funded by the son of a wealthy Argentinian businessman. Karl Gruneberg, the first director, sort of treated the Institute of Social Research as kind of an institute that would sociologically study the labor movement. So no connection to philosophy, there was really no theory in that first iteration of the institute. When Horkheimer takes over, he makes it much more philosophical, and he actually moves it away from the labor movement. Right, so he actually says that his goal is to kind of continue Marx's project of engaging in a ruthless criticism of the existing order. Right, that famous phrase from Marx's 1843 letter to Arnold de Luca. So in his inaugural lecture, upon taking his chair, Horkheimer sort of lays out this vision for the Institute, and he sort of isolates three areas of study: the economic life of society, the psychic development of individuals, and changes in the realm of culture. Notice, even in this initial vision, there's no politics. There's no idea of activism. There's no idea of an agent of change. Right? This is a very passive vision. even here. So that's 1930. 1937, the Institute by this point is in New York, right? They fled from the Nazis, and Horkheimer writes a second programmatic texts, Traditional and Critical Theory, probably more famous than Tasks and Institute, his inaugural lecture. And although 7 years later, he still claims that critical theory is driven by this idea of a future society as a community of free men, by this point, critical theory has become much more pessimistic and much more resigned to sort of society as it is. So it's become almost in some sense purely analytical. Most notably, the economic aspect, right, this first goal that was laid out in 1930 is gone completely. Institutions which were never present, or now never really present in any sort of foundational sense, are also gone. Right? There's a sort of focus on individuals as the objects of culture, and as the objects of kind of these bigger forces, never as subjects. But there's no theory of change, there's no theory of action in Frankfurt School. And the object of study, really interesting about theory of study, I guess the definition of the word critique changes. Critique, which had been initially laid out in this kind of Marxist sense, right, of internal criticism with the goal to transformation, internal criticism of kind of society itself, switches, and it now becomes a critique of instrumental reason. So it becomes almost a Kantian critique, right, a critique of a faculty, a critique of kind of individuals' ability to conceive of the world. Right, you see this, especially kind of dialectic of enlightenment, and even in kind of later works into the 1950s. There's also a move almost from Marxism to the Washington School. That's a term from Gabe Rockmore, which admittedly is polemical, and I'll explain what that means. Right, so by the early 1930s, the Institute drops its orientation towards the workers' movement, and it sort of drops its connection to an interest in class politics, and it increasingly turns towards this analogy of analysis of culture and authority. And I like this phrase of, instead of politicizing academia, it academicized politics, right? So it really turns into this academic study. And these programmatic changes only accelerate after the Institute for Social Research, the Institute for Soziale Forschung, moves to the US in 1934. At this point, I don't think there was ever a really strong political element, but at this point that element is discouraged completely. So Marcuse in multiple interviews has reported, right, that Horkheimer strictly forbade any type of political activity so as not to endanger the Institute's position in the US. And in a letter to Adorno in '56, so this is right, World War II is over, the Institute's back in Germany, in Frankfurt. Horkheimer writes to Adorno, "We don't want people to say that our writings are so terribly radical." Right, so this is a real step back. And even sort of, you look at kind of the ideals that are put forward in some of the texts for the first generation, they're very much bourgeois ideals of the kind of independent, free individual, right? Not kind of ideals focused on politics or on sort of the labor movement. Sorry. Just have it there. There we go. Okay. Additionally, and this is sort of why the Washington School, at this period, many of the Institute's members, or sort of not Horkheimer Adorno, but many of the more peripheral members of the Institute, I think they were disappointed by this kind of lack of praxis, lack of practical aspect of the Institute. They're also sort of starting to get denied funding. Horkheimer is not the best fundraiser in the US, despite his sort of efforts to cozy into the institutions. So a lot of them actually begin to work for the US Intelligence Services, right? Either the Office of War Information, Liebenthal, or mostly the Office of Strategic Services, Marcuse, Neumann, and Kirchheimer. right? So they seek the practical aspect of politics by working for the US government, right? Something that I think sort of most of the people, most leftists who look at the first generation today don't want to think about this aspect. And so this sort of is the background for why even MPhil argues that the Frankfurt School has become the Washington School during this period. And I think that's admittedly polemical, but sometimes polemic is good. Okay, so I think it's possible to explain this kind of transformation due to sort of Horkheimer's political instincts and his desire not to get thrown out of the US, or not to flee the US, as he had to flee Germany. But I actually don't think that that interpretation can be a full answer. I don't think it really holds up. So first of all, right, as I pointed out already in that quotation from the letter, this attitude continues after the institutes return to Germany. So especially in the 1950s, Horkheimer aligns himself with the kind of center-right CDU, and he even sort of supports the US war in Vietnam. And Habermas, who is supposed to be the kind of liberal conformist, is actually kicked out of the institute for being too activistic and too left-wing. Right? And so Habermas writes about Horkheimer in this period, right, that his public demeanor and his policy for the institute seem to us to be almost an expression of an opportunistic conformity, which is at odds with the critical division which, after all, he embodied. And there are great letters you can find now from between Adorno and Horkheimer, where they're arguing about Habermas. And Horkheimer really sort of saying Habermas is this radical, he wants to write about revolution. This is completely unacceptable. Right? This is not what sort of what we consider critical theory to be. And second, right, I think sort of the first generation really severed critical theory's ties to praxis. Right? So Adorno says this explicitly when he calls critical theory a Flaschenpost, right? This kind of message in a bottle. Right? It's not supposed to have any effects in the present. And Horkheimer, right, when he pushes Habermas out of the Institute for Social Research, right, he does so precisely because Habermas has the gall to think about the possibility of liberation from, quote, the shackles of bourgeois society. So, in light of all this, I want to make the argument that much of the literature makes a mistake in criticizing Habermas for having abandoned the radical tradition of the first generation in favor of the kind of mainstream liberal philosophy, which sort of finds peace in itself and is pragmatistic. So many sort of these commentators argue that Habermas's revisions to critical theory are an insidious ruse, and that sort of critical theory should have stuck closer to Adorno. But I really think the opposite is true. And I think the opposite is true for a couple of reasons. First, I think that by moving away from cultural studies and psychoanalysis to a sort of more political theory with an institutional focus, Habermas actually gives critical theory back a kind of a praxis element and an orientation towards change that was no longer present in the first generation. And so this sense, I think, reinvigorates the Frankfurt School's commitment to a theory dominated at every turn by concern for reasonable conditions of life. Or they're quoting traditional critical theory there. So that's on the theoretical or philosophical level, or the scientific level, right? Wissenschaftlich. Second, I think that by connecting theory to practice via his work as a public intellectual, Habermas also reinvigorates what he has called this kind of emancipatory interest of science by seeking to sort of become a force within society to stimulate change. And so now I'll just briefly give you a rundown of how I think that works. So, I think that much of the ire directed to Habermas by people like Raymond Geuss and the kind of realists, or kind of other left-wing critics, is this idea that he separates theory from practice. Right? That he says kind of philosophy needs to do its work and politics needs to do its work. Right? These are two separate areas of life. Each kind of, in this kind of Weberian conception, with their own internal logics, right? And one makes a mistake in mixing them. So I think that's the origin of a lot of the critiques of Habermas's approach, right? So Habermas's approach, I think, is really based on this kind of Weberian idea of an ever greater differentiation of social life, right? Separation of value spheres, right? So he then says that one should talk about philosophical questions philosophically, sociological questions sociologically, and political questions politically. On the first level, I think this was already the case in the first generation. Right? The theory is completely separated from any kind of conception of social change or of political activism. But I also think that there's more to it than that. I actually think that we should take this distinction seriously. I think a lot of activist philosophy is just bad philosophy. Right? I think good philosophy, good theory, is done for its own sake. And then it can only be applied to practice in a second step. Right? I think applying theory to practice too directly has the danger of injuring both theory and practice. Right? It's going to be bad theory and probably bad practice. And I think that actually doing this, Adorno himself, Habermas himself says that he's following Adorno. Right? Adorno, for instance, noted in a 1969 interview, pretty shortly before his death, right, that theory is much more capable of having practical consequences owing to the strength of its own objectivity, than if it had subjected itself to practices from the start. So that's kind of the scientific, philosophical, theoretical level. And I'm using science always with this kind of connotation of Wissenschaft, where it's not natural science, and the way that we use it in English usually. So, in this book, Habermas has a chapter that's entitled What Theories Can Accomplish and What They Can't. And with his relatively constrained understanding, philosophy is limited to translating the kind of specialized technical insights of the other sciences, right, both the Geisteswissenschaften and the Naturwissenschaften, into the knowledge that we have acquired about the world and what it means for us. Right, so philosophy is almost like a mediator between kind of specialized discourses of science and public discourses. But it is still in this kind of objective realm, right, where it is not in and of itself arguing for a certain position, at least not a political position. So Habermas notes that although philosophy helped to clarify the preconditions for social transformation, he argues that it cannot be of any help in identifying appropriate actors or strategies for political struggle, because these can only be achieved in practical discourses among the participants. Right, so he actually thinks that it's kind of a mistake, both that you're probably going to get it wrong if you try to determine ahead of time strategies and actors. They're not really going to probably get it wrong. You actually think that it's kind of a violation of the freedom of those actors. Right, that actually places chains on movements. Right, that movements need to be free to decide strategies by themselves. There's a certain democratic quality to that the theorist shouldn't be interfering with. Right, that determining things ahead of time, in some sense, is like trying to determine recipes for the cookshops of the future. Right, as Marx famously says he will not do in the preface to the third German edition of Capital, the first volume of Capital. So, that said, Habermas has consistently sought to performatively refute the objection that his theory of communicative action is applied to institutional reality. And I argue that he does that through both his theory of the public sphere and his participation in the public sphere. Right, so there's this kind of famous line he has where he says why he sees himself as both different from Marx and a successor to Marx. He says the utopian aspects of theory have moved from the concept of labor to the concept of communication. So, I put up here, right, the German, this is actually the 1989 reissue, the cover that I put up here. But this is actually sort of Habermas's first book, 1962. And interestingly, it's precisely this book, which served as Habermas's rehabilitation, that was the sort of proximate cause of his departure from the Institute for Social Research in 1959. Right, Horkheimer pushes him out precisely because Habermas's work on public sphere is agitating the students. Right, this is pretty much almost a full decade ahead of the student movement of 68 and 69. In Instructional Transformation, I'm sure you're all familiar with it, so I won't go into the details of the argument. But very briefly, Habermas provides kind of a conception of the ideal role of discourse in democratic life. He argues that social deliberation in sort of modern society, modern differentiated democracies, is mediated by the institution of the public sphere, this Öffentlichkeit, which plays both a rational function in determining sort of what political ideas are accepted by the population, but also a supervisory function in ensuring that these ideas are implemented by sort of political institutions and political elites. Right, so they're both about figuring out what we as citizens want and about sort of holding our leaders to account, or holding institutions to account. And in this sense, right, I mean, for Habermas, the public sphere is a way of mediating the liberty of the moderns and the liberty of the ancients. Right, so the liberty of the ancients, the idea of participation, right, this is no longer available to modern citizens. Right, most of us have to work for a living. We don't have slaves to provide for our leisure. So we cannot be sort of in the agora discussing with each other, or sort of in the assembly, sort of making decisions, listening to speeches all day. It's just not feasible. And yet, we also don't want to be confined to the kind of negative liberties of the liberties of the moderns. So it's the public sphere that gives each of us as individuals an opportunity to participate in politics. Right? So not only by publishing, but also by reading, by following debates on TV, I guess, in the modern world, being on Facebook, potentially. Right? Those are all ways that we participate in political life between election cycles. By having arguments at the bar, right, with our friends, about who we should vote for, or with public policy, or the war in Ukraine. Right? Habermas sees those all as sort of ways that modern citizens can participate in democratic life. So I think this also avoids the problem that Richard Tuck has called the sleeping sovereign. Right, so it is through these debates that Habermas thinks that sort of the people retain popular sovereignty. Through these debates, and then crucially, through the effects they can have on political institutions. Okay. So, that's the scientific section of my presentation, or Habermas's theoretical framework. Now I want to talk about sort of his actual participation in public life. Because in addition to sort of theorizing the public sphere, Habermas has sort of acted as an engaged public intellectual in that very same public sphere. And in that sense, I think he's really tried to put his theory into practice. Right, it's a separate step, but he actually has tried to bring about social change while respecting the kind of limitations of his own theory. So I think this is in stark contrast to Horkheimer, and by extension to Adorno as well, who both sort of after World War II continued to maintain his distance from the explosive political events of the time and to devote itself primarily to his own personal concerns. And so as a result of this kind of orientation or commitment to this kind of secondary vocation, Habermas has intervened in pretty much every important social, political, and cultural debate in the Federal Republic of Germany and in the kind of German public spheres since 1949. And increasingly since the 1990s, is engaged with the kind of emerging transnational European public sphere as well. So here in the corner, I put up just a little diagram of how of the theory itself. And for Habermas, public intellectuals are firmly kind of in this area here. Right, so public intellectuals have no special status. Philosophers have no special status in the public sphere. They're mainly they're just citizens speaking to their fellow citizens and trying to convince them of the correctness of their arguments. Right, so in this sense, this is also consistent with Habermas's broader philosophy, right, where the only power a public intellectual has is the unenforced force of their argument, right? So Habermas argues, right, that precisely because philosophy, or scholarship in general, science, has its own internal logic, that public intellectuals don't have any special status, but in public, because they earn their living separately from their public interventions, they have a kind of independence. And that gives them an opportunity to speak truth to power because that's this privilege of not living for the public sphere. This is the difference between a public intellectual and a commentator, right? Somebody who gets paid to go on TV and give hot takes. Where the whole point is to be as controversial as possible so you get invited back. That's not the goal of the public intellectual. But the public intellectual is not trying to produce clickbait, is not trying to get multiple visits to sell advertisements on his blog, right, or whatever, on his Facebook page. The public intellectual is paid by the university, does his work, and only enters the public sphere when he or she, when they feel compelled to do so on behalf of voices that otherwise would not be heard, on behalf of truths that are being ignored, whatever. So it's precisely because it is this kind of Nebenberuf that public intellectuals can do this, can intervene when current events are affecting to spin out of control. And in their engagement, Habermas contends that public intellectuals have no special status, right? They just are limited to mobilizing the relevant issues, information, and arguments for public disputes. And in this way, Habermas argues that public intellectuals, their vocation, in a sense, is to defend the feedback loop between an informed living discourse in response to civil society. Right, so defend this feedback loop through communicative exchange. So in some sense, right, public intellectuals are supposed to facilitate good arguments in informal public spheres to ensure that they get heard by formal public spheres. I'll give you a quick example of this, very quick. So since the 1990s, Habermas has taken an acute interest in the European Union, and especially since 2010, when the Euro crisis, or the crisis of the Eurozone really broke out, right? And for the first 2 years, people often forget this, first 2 years after Lehman Brothers falls, the financial crisis doesn't really affect Europe in earnest. It starts to affect Europe in earnest in February of 2010. And that's when Angela Merkel famously suggests that she might push the Greeks out of the Eurozone in order to win a regional election in Baden-Württemberg. And it's then that you start to get separation in bond yields. Right? And that's when the Euro crisis hits home, necessitating all the interventions, and most notably, necessitating Mario Draghi's famous words, right, that he will do whatever it takes to ensure the cohesion of the Eurozone and its survival. Right, so it's a discursive sentence by Angela Merkel that sets off the Euro crisis, and it's arguably a sentence by Draghi that resolves it. There's obviously a lot more there, but that's the simplest way to put it. And both of those, notice, are sentences for public consumption in the public sphere. Anyway, so in all of his interventions since that time, and there have been many of them, Habermas has consistently sought to push public debate in Germany and the rest of Northern Europe to recognize that showing more solidarity with the crisis-ridden South is both kind of normatively the right thing to do and prudently kind of the only logical step, right, even sort of practically speaking. So he often draws on kind of his philosophical background to engage in what he has called little exercises in conceptual analysis to show that the asymmetric effects of politically unregulated interdependence to the national economies have an obligation to act in solidarity. Right, so he's trying to make this kind of theoretical argument about kind of what the fact that the only way to stand up to global financial markets, right, and their desire to take advantage of differential bond yields is to act collectively. Right, the only way to stand up to economic power is by combined political power. Right? So the individual member states cannot do that on their own. Right, as the Euro crisis has demonstrated quite powerfully. And so, although Habermas identifies Germany and Northern Europe as his kind of key institutional actors, his appeals are addressed to citizens of these states through the national public spheres. Right, so he often has his texts, he often writes in the German public sphere, but his texts will then appear, or different text interviews will then appear sort of in Dutch translations, into Volkskrant, for instance, but in other areas, which try to convince citizens to support kind of more solidaristic policies at the national level. In this sense, the explicit goal of his commentaries is to broaden the spectrum of relevant arguments in an attempt to improve the lamentable level of public debate. Right, so he's trying to convince people, but most of all, he's trying to put arguments on the table and ensure better democracy, more legitimate democracy, through better public debate. So what's the future for Europe? So Habermas is open to the fact that solving the problems of the EU and the Eurozone will most likely require treaty change, institutional change. But he actually suggests that kind of the real most important institution for Europe is precisely the development of a common European public sphere. And he says that this is maybe what the Greek crisis, or the Euro crisis more generally, the opportunity it offers Europe, is the fact that all of a sudden, across Europe, for arguably the first time, perhaps since the Iraq War, maybe it's the first time since the Iraq War, the first time ever, states across the Union are discussing the same issues. Right, so everyone, whether you're reading Spanish newspapers, Italian newspapers, Greek newspapers, German newspapers, they're all discussing the same issues. Perhaps from slightly different perspectives. But even though there's not one common public sphere, the same issues are coming up everywhere. So that's kind of functionally plays the same role as a common European public sphere. Right, so you notice that a common European sphere would not necessarily require changes to the infrastructure of national public spheres. They necessitate the opening of national public spheres to one another. So in Germany, for example, we are informed about the post-war discussions in Spain, Greece, Italy, France, or both. And arguably that's what's happening in the Euro crisis. Right, so actually is quite hopeful about that development. And I think that this example shows how Habermas, that's what he thinks, that philosophers can engage public debates as persistence without short-circuiting the open nature of debates in a public sphere where there can be only participants, right, where everyone is equal. Everyone has a kind of equal status. So, sort of start concluding, I have 3 more slides. It's got a standard complaint that kind of is critical of Habermas is of capitalism, that he and his followers regularly affirm that there's no alternative. This is kind of a critique that Tom Rockmore has made repeatedly over the last 30 years. And I really think that this is kind of wrong. I think sort of if you read Habermas's writings on colonization from a theoretical perspective, or even sort of a lot of his political writings, it's clear that he's very much against these kind of ideas of no alternatives, against technocracy, which is also written about extensively. And sort of this book, which is all about Habermas' opposition to technocracy really builds on, theoretically, on his debates with Karl Popper in the 1970s, late 60s and early 1970s. In a sense, right, the whole point for Habermas has been not that sort of the economists are right and just need to do what they say and sort of give in to the logic of capitalism, but that the only way to oppose global capitalism, global financialized capitalism, is sort of by having politics catch up with global markets, and to sort of establish politics as a separate sphere of the life world that is able to oppose the kind of systematic effects of the economy, and of money. So in that sense, right, he argues that a European public sphere, or more active European public sphere, is necessary to create a transnational democracy that can combat the executive federalism of global financial markets and the institutions that support them, right, like the Troika, like the IMF, and like the European Commission. Right, and so he notes that my hope is that the neoliberal agenda will no longer be accepted at face value, but will be open to challenge. The whole program of subordinating the life world to the imperatives of market must be subjected to scrutiny. Okay, so to reiterate kind of my basic points to summarize, I think that these kind of critiques here, right, of this idea that Habermas's theory doesn't have emancipatory potential, I think they're really mistaken. And for at least 3 reasons. So first, right, a lot of people like Rockmore want to talk about Jordan Bruckheimer, especially Jordan. But the radicalism of the first generation is really a myth, I want to argue, at least on the political level, on the level of any kind of ability to change the world. Second, I think it overlooks the kind of critique of institutions and the kind of institutional way out of these problems that Habermas offers us, both in his theory and also sort of in his example as a public intellectual. And sort of, I think this is, again, it's a mediated relationship. Remember, Habermas doesn't think there's a direct line from theory to practice. But I would argue that actually sort of, for him at least, making that direct line is actually illicit, right? It's undemocratic. It's robbing actors of their agency. And it's giving theory and science a kind of technocratic power that it should not have in democratic life. Right? The idea that a theorist can stand up and say, I know what's right for you. I'm going to be the philosopher king. For Habermas, that's wrong, right? That's the danger of applying theory to practice directly. So in other words, in order to understand the kind of political implications of Habermas' work, I think we need to pay more attention to kind of his understudied political writing, that is activities of the public intellectual. And just to say a word about kind of the role of theory, this has become a huge debate right now in political, social political theory. Right? How should theorists relate to politics, to the real world? In large part, right, this debate about activist political theory or activist philosophy, in part is driven by kind of institutional pressures by universities, on academics. Right? I mean, in the UK, this is known as the impact agenda, right? Where a really good way to get promoted is to have an impact case study, right? To show that your work sort of was taken up by some parliamentarian and was it law. If you get cited in law in the UK, you will get promoted to professor instantly. So I think sort of a lot of people want to be relevant. They're trying to sort of apply things directly. That's what us into these kind of debates. And I think that's problematic. And in particular, I think that we need to sort of pay attention to the difference between theory and practice. That's not to say we separate them completely or if they have nothing to do with each other, but we kind of should respect some of the boundaries between them. And in particular, right, nowadays you have kind of these various different models that are proposed. For example, the model of public philosophy. I think sort of the most famous public philosopher is somebody like Joe Wolfe at the Didactic School at Oxford. So he almost always, at any point in time, is serving on 3 or 4 different parliamentary research committees, giving advice to Parliament. Right, so that's kind of the direct, right? You don't engage public debate, you go to Parliament, you get appointed to a committee, and you tell them this is what you should do. I, as a philosopher, tell you this is the right step to take. You have these kind of self-styled realists, right? People like Raymond Goyce, Bernard Williams, and all of their followers, are saying that kind of political theory needs to answer the question, who, right? It needs to be directly relevant to politics. You have this third strand of kind of proponents of democratic underlaboring, who sort of say that, well, our job as political theorists is to sort of help these, they don't put it this way, I'm caricaturing it a little bit, but this is the basic message, is to help these kind of stupid citizen non-philosophers to understand what they really should think. And so all of these three positions sort of think that political theorists need to engage in public policy as philosophers, right? With their professional expertise directly. And again, I think this is very dangerous because I really think that sort of these kind of direct interventions threaten to supplant or short circuit the democratic process instead of contributing to it. I think it's actually these kind of attitudes that lead to a lot of the backlash against experts and against kind of public intellectuals that we see in public spheres around the world today. It is precisely this kind of idea that we know what's right and we'll tell you. Or we'll bypass you completely and go directly to Parliament and tell them. Because you're not smart enough to figure it out yourselves. So in some sense, the actual problem with such unmediated forms of public engagement is that they encourage philosophers to kind of hide behind the backs of their fellow citizens. By contrast, Habermas's approach is based on equal participation, which forces philosophers to renounce all the forms of authority narcissism and respect the autonomy and rational capacity of democratic citizens to make their own decisions. So, I'll leave it there, and I look forward to your questions.